Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to another afternoon tea and truth biscuits. Thank you all very much for coming back. I'm really excited and grateful to see how many of you have subscribed. We now have 192 subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed yet, it would be great to maybe make it up to 200. Thank you. And don't forget to share. You can anytime during the show, you can also put little messages in the chat, and I'll be watching out for those if you have any questions for our guest. It's been a really emotionally difficult month or two for us, for everyone, I think, with everything that's been happening in Ukraine. It's been a scary time, and I appreciate your patience as, you know, we've been absent for a couple of weeks. It's been, you know, stressful. I've been busy. We've all been working on trying to fight the problems at hand. And we may be returning to talk a little bit about Ukraine a little bit later. We've had a couple of episodes, which I hope you joined us for, looking at that already, but it's obviously not over and a very changing dynamic. So we may talk again about that. But I want us to shift back, I think, to talk about the last couple of years, because we've been through a really hellish pandemic. And the information environment has been rapidly moving during that and shifting and changing the threat environment. And we're going to talk today about with an expert on how misinformation and misunderstandings have spread online. So I have E Rosalie, hi Rosalie, and Henry the dog, who are going to be talking with us today. Rosalie is a scholar, a graduate scholar at Johns Hopkins School of Health, who's also done a lot of research into disinformation behind some really important journalism in recent years as well. So maybe she can talk to us a little bit about that. Also, she's interested in this intersection between public health and security. So that's going to be a focus today. Rosalie's looked at some of the extremism that has been building around these kinds of misunderstandings and quite conspiratorial kind of messaging that we see, and the responses as well to these kinds of threats. Rosalie, welcome. Have you got your cup of tea handy? I got mine.
I am.
I also have, in lieu of truth biscuits, we have Thin Mints today, which are Girl Scout cookies. I've fallen in love with these Girl Scout cookies over here in America. They're not something we have in the UK, and they're utterly fantastic. So I'm going to be dunking my Girl Scout cookies in my tea.
I had one cookie and it's gone, so.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Well, anyway, let us begin.
Yeah.
So, Rosalie, please, would you mind telling me a little bit more about how you got involved in researching these kinds of issues?
So there were two key drivers of my interest. And, one is that, I am a public health scholar, so I'm concerned with how we can improve lives. When I applied to Hopkins, I thought I knew what the problem was. It was that we weren't communicating with people. And if we did that better, everything would be okay. Yeah. That was wrong. And what I realized is that there were people who had a very vested interest in misinforming us for whether it's financial or political reasons. And I found that these bad actors were sophisticated in a way that I think the general public and even the media failed to fully understand. I was alarmed for sure. Right. The realization, it was personal for me because I had been misled by what I later learned were likely intentional misinformation or disinformation campaigns through this ecosystem that had flourished on social media. When I realized that, I went back in my Facebook posts and I found websites that I recognize now are disinformation websites. And I looked into what made me share those posts. And
Wow.
in general, I was outraged. I thought that what I was seeing was an injustice. And I think that's an important thing that I found, because I used to hold views that were illogical if you have all of the information.
Right.
But the conclusions I reached were reasonable given the information that I had received. I'm the same person. And I think that we don't realize that compassionate people that authentically care can be subverted and sidelined by being misled. And that realization that I was essentially being robbed of choice
Wow.
and led to support things that I wouldn't have if I had been fully informed. That really drove home the importance of it. And so I think if I was put in a sentence, I went into this field because if we don't solve this problem, none of the other ones matter.
Yes, absolutely. It's so important. Wow. Can you give us a couple of examples of the type of things that you would share in the past and then realized, were not true?
Oh, God.
Can you think of anything?
I can. I just kind of like hesitate because I don't want to like derail it into a lot of them were, I will say, partisan posts.
I think it brings it home because we're all, like, I think in the past, I mean, I certainly will have shared things before, before I started like working on this without realizing, because, I think when social media first started to happen, everybody like didn't think and shared and shared and shared because that's how it worked. That was how it worked. That's how they got us all into this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they were manipulating us with all these kind of like emotional triggers. And it's really hard until you learn about it and step out of that. Of course you do this. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, but with health, I think it's really, it's so important, and it ends up, where that goes is some place that's extremely dangerous, isn't it? And I think this juncture that you're getting to as well with security is a key point. How has the kind of public knowledge and the misinformation over this like pandemic, how has it been transforming from your research?
So to answer this, I think you really have to go back even to around 2000. I did a review of the 2 decades of the current vaccine hesitancy that we see. Sorry, Henry here, he's very engaged. Okay. And I found newspaper articles and journals, and there was just a lot of evidence of doctors expressing frustration that they were being given, they had patients who were coming that were misinformed. They didn't know how to handle it. They said that it was spreading on websites. They didn't know what to do. Yeah. And the main response from the CDC was to publish academic papers in academic journals and say, well, these things aren't true. Okay. And I think they really, this failing in this time led to the development of an alternate media and information ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And because they weren't really engaging the people, meeting them where they were and answering the questions that they had, that didn't mean that other people weren't willing to. Yes. And so if you think that's where we are when the pandemic started, mm-hmm. and in the US, believe it or not, the data show in the beginning that the members of Congress, that they weren't polarized on this specific issue at the beginning. And then in the first week of February, we see them polarize. Yeah. And as the pandemic went on, the messaging became increasingly polarized. Eventually, we saw tactics of disinforming the public that we ordinarily expect from Russia, China, and autocracies. And we saw American elected officials using their public office to disinform the public, to disinform the public in a way that I think was exceptional. It was exceptional in its frequency. It was exceptional in that it directly encouraged or fostered mistrust in people and sources that were devoted to serving the public. Mm-hmm. and the consequence was that it may well have hurt the US response to the pandemic.
Yeah.
But more worrisome is that the messaging in some cases mirrored that of US adversaries.
Okay.
And there are potential implications there that create the threats not just to public health, but to national security as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, you say mirroring the adversaries. The thing is, it's very hard to know as well whether there's some of that being influenced directly. And I think one of the things that I've highlighted often is like we need to understand more about the actors behind this. Is it just people being misinformed? Are they being misinformed by foreign actors? And also there's this question of, does it matter? And some people say, when it comes to public health, if it's false, and maybe it doesn't. But I think it can be very difficult for people to know what to trust sometimes. You're right, there's been this like political effort to downplay, reduce trust in our kind of health system and our trust, all of the kind of institutions that during a pandemic you need to be able to trust. But there's also like disagreements between scientists and doctors that are being pushed out there as well, aren't there? There is disagreement in science sometimes. So how does the public know which scientists to trust?
That's a good question. And this is something, this particular issue is, again, personal. I think everybody in this field is somehow like personally drawn to it. We can be misled really easily if they put a doctor or PhD in front of somebody's name and put them on TV and ask their opinion. Mm-hmm. What you as the viewer should be asking is about the person's history. What did they study in school? Are they at all qualified to speak on this? Have they published on this specific topic? If they studied it 30 years ago and since then they've been doing something completely different, you want to find a different expert. Is it their area of expertise? Has been a big one throughout the pandemic. I have had people send me things and I'm like, well, this is about vaccines, and the person that you're sending to me, this is an orthopedic surgeon who, if I needed orthopedic surgery, I would consult. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm going to look for a vaccine researcher. And so I think that's just like, if there's one thing that you do that. Look at their area of expertise.
Yes, absolutely. That's so true. Even sometimes you see it's a physicist or it's a, but also I think there's, we've seen it in the past. We've seen companies and, PR firms and things like this also setting up expert labs to create the science that supports a certain conclusion sometimes as well. And, it's important to also maybe think about like who's behind these campaigns and who's funding them. Didn't we see an awful lot of kind of people seeking to profit from some of this falsehood? Did you see any of that?
Yeah, we saw people were seeking to gain from it in a lot of different ways. One of them, we did see big industry funding think tanks that would then publish recommendations specifically about herd immunity that were just totally wrong. But, if I'm not in science, I may not know how to assess the report and the way that the language they use. It all seems very credible and it can be very hard to tell. But that wasn't the only group. In October of 2020, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, they somehow, I can't remember if they attended or what they did, but anti-vaxxers, the most influential ones, met in October 2020, and they discussed how to dissuade people from getting the COVID vaccine. Now, at that time, we did not have the data saying whether or not these were safe. We just really didn't know what was going to happen. And so I think that was something that really I found upsetting. And we know that the anti-vaccine community not just anti-vaccine groups, but saw COVID and the pandemic as an opportunity to grow their movements. And in some ways, we saw the anti-vaxxers who were using it as an opportunity then become the prey of extremists who were using it as an opportunity to recruit them.
Yes.
We had adversaries. I documented an example of an advertising agency that was traced back to Russia. And they were contacting influencers to say specific things about the Pfizer vaccine.
Oh, wow.
And this was really, I think we automatically think, well, they just want to misinform people so they don't get the vaccine and hurt people in the West. And that may be some of it. But I also think that we underestimate how much Russia and China were hoping to gain politically with other countries through vaccine diplomacy. And with the reputation that these companies like Pfizer had, which was good, they weren't going to be able to compete if somebody was able to get their hands on it. And so I think there was a financial motive there too.
Right. Yes. Oh, that's really interesting. And I think people forget those kind of geopolitical pictures that are going on there. And you also have kind of this dimension of the changeover time of how this then becomes all about mandates. And there's also, I saw a lot because I researched data and so on, and quite honestly was concerned myself about, how companies and governments would exploit the kind of apps and so on for tracking COVID. Like I've seen a lot of the kind of concern being sort of pushed into paranoia around like, well, they're all spying on us, they're all tracking us, and the libertarian kind of ideology becoming a part of this. And that then obviously being maybe part of this drive towards like the protests over mandates and the convoy that we saw in Canada, which was just ground to a halt, the whole capital. Do you have any like observations over what was happening from the disinformation or misinformation during that period?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we really fail to appreciate is that one of the things that happened with the pandemic is we saw an increase of two things that are not great for our mental well-being. So we were isolated, but we were also living under uncertainty. And uncertainty is, it has a negative effect on us, and it can in the short term, but also in the long term. There was a study at Yale that came out in 2020, and they found that everybody has kind of a baseline level of paranoia. And in the study, they had people who had, we do.
Like, especially in our field.
Oh, it's not even, I'm like, is this thought that I'm having? They had people in the study that had a higher baseline level of paranoia, and people that had a lower level of paranoia. And they had them play a game, and their chances of winning would stay consistent in one game. And the people who had lower baseline paranoia, they learned from their moves, they were taking in new information, and they were processing it. Now, when you changed you made the game uncertain, the likelihood that they would win, they responded to it by behaving similar to the people who had the high baseline paranoia. They were not learning from their moves. The choices they were making did not reflect things that they should have just seen. And I think that we really have underestimated how much the way that information processing changes during crises, the effect that could have. And I think that's probably why we're seeing more people. I think the big thing was a lot of people would say, it's not just the people who are on the fringe that are being drawn in right now. And I don't think that's a surprising find given what we know.
Yes. Actually, this is something that really bothers me, is this kind of smearing of, it's all stupid Trump supporters. It's all, like people who are so silly because they follow a conspiracy theory. Actually, there's some really intelligent people who are concerned about, vaccines or about whatever it might be. There's a lot of different things that people, follow a path and end up misled on, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're stupid or that you're uneducated. Actually, it's a lot more complex than that, and a lot of it, as you say, is about the uncertainty of the world and looking for explanations. Some of these things are actually quite complex theories that people have latched onto.
And I think there is that when I talk to people who aren't in this field about the problem of mis and disinformation, I think there's a real misunderstanding in that all of us are susceptible to it. Yeah. If you think you're not, you're probably more susceptible to it than people who know that they are. Yeah. And I think that that's really important. It's not necessarily a function of how smart you are or how educated you are. In some cases, it can be. But the fact that we're all susceptible, I think, is important.
So should we be responding as in like coming up with different solutions for misinformation? So the pandemic, most of it was misinformation, yeah? I mean, there was, like you say, there's some disinformation, people deliberately trying to influence that. But, should we be finding different solutions for these? Or do you think like there are, ways of responding to this that don't require us to think about like intentionality?
So the solution that I think would truly be best is unfortunately kind of a long-term solution, and it's not addressing this necessarily. But I think, okay, we know that when crises happen, and even when there aren't crises, that we're seeing predictable mental changes. And whether it's the fire in Rome or 9/11, when we have these events, we see these upticks in paranoia and this spread. And I think that the best approach would be if we taught people about this. Why is it always the same narratives? Why is it always the government and the scientists? What about these is compelling, and what fears are they striking at? A really common one with vaccines is claims about infertility. That really strikes at the fear. I won't be able to have children. I mean, somebody is not going to be able to think about this rationally when you're scaring them with that. And so I think educating people about the different biases, the heuristics, the tendencies that we have that are exploited by bad actors, but also that we can get things wrong even when there are no bad actors. I think that this would go a long way, because I know this is anecdotal, but there's also good research on, if you teach people these tactics, that they are much better at spotting it. And I think that's the only approach that we have. Because if we just fact check things as they come out, it's the give a man a fish or teach him to fish question. And I think we should teach people to fish.
Definitely. I think I would suggest other things as well, but like you're totally right. And, I think a lot of the focus has been on trying to police the platforms and get them to do, working with journalists and working with academics on sort of, what identifying the misinformation, taking it down, or putting out labeling, or, responding in other ways, with regard to the algorithms and things like that. But, really, we do need to be getting people to think a little bit more about, what biases they have, and recognizing those biases, and thinking about, like how we can reflect more on our own susceptibility, because actually you're right, we're all susceptible. What would you say the reaction, what would you say, sort of taking down people's posts, things like that? What kind of reaction does that tend to post? Is that positive, or does it, tend to, have a negative kind of reaction among the public?
So I think this is kind of a tricky situation, because not all the platforms are the same. So the effect and the situation on Twitter is not the same as on Facebook. Right. And so it's difficult to make a recommendation like that is broad. One thing that I do generally recommend, as we're thinking about this, is I absolutely have policy recommendations for every platform. But a general thing that we could do is not discuss it as an issue of free speech, because that, I think, is the wrong place to focus. And there are real concerns about autocrats using it to silence. I mean, we've seen that. And sadly, in some cases, it seems like the platforms maybe are going along with it. But I think if we say that having a voice and having your opinion is a human right, I think we can all agree that to be amplified is a privilege. And we see this in any meeting. You cannot all stand up front and yell. Nothing good comes from that. We all agree who gets to speak and who gets to be amplified. And I think that, so I don't even like to get into what's okay on the platform, but who has a right to be amplified, I think is a decision that society makes. And we should go more in that direction, I think.
Right. And maybe making it at least more transparent so that we can discuss it.
Transparency is a big thing, because that allows people to say, well, I'm being treated unfairly. And when people say this, and I suspect they're not, but I really have to say, I don't know that they're not. Maybe they are. We should all be able to know. We should.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of my neighbors are actually conservative and are very concerned. And I do think I see around me this backlash, that people think that they are getting targeted and their voices are being suppressed and things like this. And I think this, results in sort of pushing people into more isolated groupings in society. And we do need to still be able to talk to each other and have conversations and things like that. So I think takedowns can be really negative. It depends on what kind of taking down. What it is exactly.
I mean, if it's criminal, I think this is very simple. It's criminal.
And I think there's been too much when it comes to misinformation being taken down at times, because we do need to still have debates, unfortunately, even on bad things that we don't want to hear. Sometimes we have to allow it, I think, a little bit. But yeah, I think that has also been exploited by some who want to pretend that things are just like honest opinion or whatever, and in order to dominate. And what you're saying about like amplification is a really important aspect of that, because what they're not saying when they're saying, oh, well, free speech is like, it's freedom to dominate. That's what they want.
That's what we're talking about.
And that should not be the right. That is not the right.
And it is a tough place for platforms. I do see that the bad actors sort of win either way. So what they do is they say outlandish things, really controversial things. They get a lot of attention. They're amplified. The algorithm loves it. It's that. Yeah. If the social media platform doesn't act, then they're spreading what may be, let's say, disinformation and defending other people on the platform who don't want to be there. Then I understand it's probably not great in the shareholders' eye, but if they do act, then they can potentially create a martyr who maybe very well was banned because they violated policy, not because of what they believe, but because of their behavior. Yeah. But that doesn't matter if everybody in their ecosystem believes that they were censored, believes that they were oppressed. And I think that's really important, especially, populist politicians. I think this particular tactic is most popular among, and I think really dangerous.
Yeah, actually, and I've seen, these groups then going into smaller communities that are more intensified, and where efforts to influence them and to get them to do like participate in violence, or aid intelligence operations and do all sorts of bad things, these kinds of efforts to groom them are hidden, and they're off like off in a little tiny bubble, and it gets worse and worse because all they see around them are people like them. So I worry about creating these deliberately, essentially, by booting people out of the mainstream.
Yeah.
It's sorry, go on.
No, sorry. I'm just like, oh, I have all the things to say. No.
All the things.
Right after the attack on January 6th in the US, I wrote about Telegram, and RT in particular had shifted their messaging. They changed their profile, everything. It was it was something about freedom from censorship. I mean, they were going all in on this. And they had a Western audience. A lot of the people in there seemed American, who they were able to influence much more directly, and they were polling them so that they could adapt potentially techniques for manipulation. And I was like, I'm really worried about this. And now over a year out, I mean, the growth of Telegram, and I don't think it's all been bad, but I think that marginalizing people is probably not the way to handle it. I don't think. I think that we need to understand what is motivating people in these groups. And a really good example you brought up were the Trump supporters. And I think it's really easy to write them off. And certainly there are people in among his support that do have objectionable views, but some of them are there because they're from a rural town. The suicide rates there are high. The issues with addiction and the opioid crisis have completely rocked these communities. They haven't seen their standard of living go up, and they are suffering.
Yeah.
And someone came and heard them and maybe didn't tell them the truth about what was causing those problems in their lives. But I think that we can, like, the better way to handle it would be to go there, and to get to those concerns, I think.
Yeah. Oh, you're so right. You mentioned RT. I just wanted to ask you before we wrap up, what you're looking at right now. Are you looking at Ukraine?
I am. Even before the invasion started, obviously, Ukraine is always on my radar. The people there, they're like born with a master's in disinformation. I love it. They all know, they understand it so well. But what I've seen is, the targeting of soldiers specifically was something that I was very interested in the beginning, and understanding what they do in their society, that they effectively do mitigate a lot of disinformation, and understanding how they do that. I think the most profound realization that I had is they are being brutally attacked in their homes. And I mean, can you imagine accomplishing anything in that setting? And they've mounted a better counter information strategy than the US has domestically perhaps ever. It's just,
they knew it was coming, though. They've known this was coming for a long time, and quite honestly, it came in 2014, and
yes, it really did. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's as much preparedness and rather than this moment. Yeah, they didn't just suddenly,
right, these weren't built. But I think the reason that the infrastructure is effective is that their society understands these tactics. They understand the ways that we're manipulated. And I think that's why it's effective.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we need to understand this better as a society. I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much. And thank you to Henry. I think he's gone, but
so he's over here and he's like, please.
I see his nose. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, and for everybody else who's watching. I really appreciate you coming back every single time. Please do subscribe and share the video afterwards, in case anybody else didn't see. Thank you so much, Rosalie. It was so lovely to meet you. Bye.
Bye.